All right, so moving right along, let's talk about a movement called Scholasticism, which I think, in terms of continuity and change, is a really interesting connection between the classical era and really the upcoming Renaissance era. So, the key figure to keep in mind for this movement was Thomas Aquinas. And what Scholasticism ultimately was this attempt to reconcile old and new knowledge, right? So he was trying to take Aristotelian science and uh, other philosophic beliefs and ultimately combine it with new ideas, right, with deep Christianity. So that's what scholasticism is. Aquinas argued that faith was not endangered by logical thinking. So it's an interesting foreshadow to the Renaissance in the sense that one of the key new ideas to the Renaissance is questioning previously established ideas, questioning the universe, using evidence to prove things. So even though Thomas Aquinas was around in the 13th century, you can already see that that new type of thinking is coming. Aquinas' view opened up the way for secularism and Christian humanism in the Renaissance, as well as for later Enlightenment ideas of progress, reason, and natural law. So he's a really good figure to use for continuity and change. In terms of religious orders, when we're talking about a religious order, we're referring to a monastery or a convent, right? So a religious order is various groups of monks or nuns, and they're living in vowed communities, and they're parts of the Catholic Church. And what's interesting about religious orders, as I've already alluded to in previous videos, is that it's really the clergy that maintains literacy in medieval Europe. So they are key in these orders to advancing Europe's progress, or maybe in sometimes you could just say maintaining the status quo of their knowledge. So, because of their literacy, they keep learning alive. They promote practical advice, such as using better agricultural methods. So, things like the three field system are going to be a product to a certain extent of the knowledge preserved and advanced in religious orders. There were different orders. Examples are the Benedictines, the Franciscans, Dominicans, Knights Templar. And within the rules of the Catholic Church, they also follow their own unique regulations. And these orders combine clerical, missionary, and secular duties, sometimes all in one. So two interesting examples of that. An example of a military secular duty specifically would be the Knights Templar and the Teutonic Knights. So you can remember these orders and their connection with the military because they both have knights in their title. So the Knights Templar, they were founded during the Crusades, and they combined the functions of knights and monks together. And they were key in the Crusades. They fought to try to get the Holy Land from Muslims, and another thing that connects them more to the church, less to the military element, is that they also cared for the sick and injured, both in a medical sense, but also in a religious sense. The Teutonic Knights, fought pagan Slavs near the Baltic Sea, so they were more northern, and they introduced Christian missions and churches in that area. So, two good examples of connecting the religious and secular world if you talk about those two orders. A key example also of how learning is preserved, how it continues, how it develops, is of course in universities that are established in the medieval era in Europe. Some of the oldest ones, you have the Salerno Medical School in Italy, and this was completed in the 9th century, although it was a very long-lasting institution, still exists. But when it was originally founded, its teachings were mainly based on knowledge handed down from the ancient Greek times, so during the time of Hippocrates. They based most of their teachings on a Greek physician named Galen. You see him here. He lived in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and he lived in what is now present-day Turkey. And also there was other medical information shaping the Salerno University from the Arab world. So this is key because, as we've already discussed, it's a prosperous time for the Middle East during this historical period. And so it's due to their prosperity to a large extent that this medical scientific knowledge is preserved in Western Europe when it's in general experiencing a period of decay. Another medieval university established in Paris in the 12th century, University of Paris. What's interesting is when the university was first established, it was so small that students often shared the books while they were attending lectures. The two main subject areas were liberal arts or theology, so you do still see a close church connection there. And universities that were set up in medieval Europe established within the university, they set up colleges, which acted as boarding houses for scholars. And they were occasionally divided according to students' nationality or discipline. And when these colleges within the universities were founded, it was in a response to disputes between students and townspeople. Universities granted students licenses to teach after they completed years of study and passed an exam. Early schools founded in the UK, Cambridge and Oxford, obviously still very well known, they're also founded in the 12th century. So a lot of significant educational development even in the medieval era. And of course, that only expands in Western Europe once we get into the Renaissance. So for comparison, obviously key AP skill, just key general skill when we're studying history. If we're comparing, mainly focusing on the Abbasid dynasty and compare and contrast that to Western Europe. In terms of education, both East and West are interested in recording and preserving classical works from Greece and Rome. The Abbasids combined classical knowledge, though, with new developments coming from India as well as from other parts of the Islamic world. So that's a key distinction there. So if anything, once we reach the Renaissance, this increased knowledge from the East is going to add to Renaissance ideas. Western universities used Latin as the language of pedagogy, and they focused on liberal arts such as rhetoric, in addition to theological studies. And in Eastern universities, specifically the Abbasids, their main languages of study are Arabic and Persian. And another addition in their studies is new ideas in math and science. We've mentioned earlier the Arabic numeral system. Key to know that one. It actually originated, despite the name Arabic numerals, it originated in India. But is then extended to the Arab world and eventually to the West. And the Arabic numeral system is the same one that we use in our numeral system, 0 to 9 as the base. Arabic became the language of science for this medieval time period, which is key if we're thinking about the preservation of knowledge. In terms of medicine, medical advances were slow to arrive in Western Europe. So the best hospitals in the world in this time were in the Arabic-speaking world. One reason for the difference may have been due to religious sanctions. So the Muslim empires did autopsies and they conducted research with human cadavers. But in Europe, the church's influence forbade working on cadavers. So that was a major setback to medical knowledge in Western Europe. Also, there were key medical scholars that were coming from the Arabic world. Key one was, or beyond the Arabic world, just the Muslim world rather, because the key example I wanted to give was Avicenna, who lived in the 10th and 11th centuries. So he was a Persian scholar. He was actually known as the father of modern medicine, and he wrote a text called the Canon of Medicine, and for 600 years, this text served as a reference book for medical students and doctors. And advances of Southwest and East Asian civilizations were also ahead of those in medieval Europe. But the key thing is that when Europe caught up, during the Renaissance, it was very, very quick to then catch up to this lack of knowledge that it had in the medieval era. Absorbing new goods and ideas would lead Europeans to vast exploration and expansion in the coming centuries using Asian technologies such as paper and agricultural tools. So during this time, Muslims believed that Europeans were backward and even dirty. And then Europeans believed that Muslims were pagan infidels. Some considered them inhuman. So in the medieval era, there was this major xenophobia. And what's interesting is, as we've already mentioned the Crusades in previous videos in this segment, this connection, even though they're fighting one another, opens up interest in additional trade and contact later. So, despite their views on one another, they still have a deep interest in exchanging goods. Uh, so, as Western Europeans became more open to these new ideas and as more unified political units looked towards protection and expansion of their own trade, conflict seemed inevitable. So, it was kind of this, I mean, they want each other for trade, but at the same time, as the world grows, they have trouble existing in such close proximity. So, last but not least, since this is not a European history course, I only really briefly want to touch upon the Renaissance. So, if you want more, there's a whole lot in European history curriculum, and I will eventually make videos on those when I teach AP Euro again in the future. So in the Renaissance, it's a period that's marked with expansion of trade as well as the growth of an agricultural surplus in Western Europe, and it leads to a revival of interest in learning and the arts. There's a growing middle class during this time, and they have access to money that was available to patronize craftspeople, teachers, and in the wealthy patronize the arts. The Renaissance was characterized by a revival of interest in classical Greek and Roman literature, art, civic virtue, culture. So again, as we've already talked about, it's really key then that this knowledge was preserved from the ancient era, so that you have clergy members in Western Europe who are continuing to preserve these ancient texts, and you also have Muslim scholars who are preserving them at the same time. Key Renaissance ideas are humanism, which was the revival of antiquity, or antiquity is also just classical knowledge. It focuses on individuals rather than God. So there's also a secular component to it. And humanism focused on education and reform. So, for example, there were handbooks of behavior that came out during this time, so the 15th, 16th century. People began to consider not only their place in heaven, but also their place in the world. And that's a key difference from medieval thinking, which was much more religious, much less focused on the current life, much more focused on the afterlife. Cultural changes during the Renaissance, such as the increased use of vernacular language, propelled the rise of powerful monarchies, the centralization of government, and the birth of nationalism. So lots of idea changes during the Renaissance. Just it's a major shift in just the way people lived. There were, just for simplicity's sake, we focus on the Renaissance in two geographic areas: the Southern, or the Italian Renaissance, and then the Renaissance in Northern Europe. So the Italian Renaissance flourished in the city-states of Italy and Spain. The focus, or when I say the Italian Renaissance, I also just mean the Southern, the more Catholic, eventually Renaissance. The focus is still very clearly under the church. The church acts as one of the major patrons to the arts. In other words, they were funding art projects. Artists couldn't afford to make these things otherwise, so they needed to have people to fund them. So what's interesting is, if we go way back, even to the medieval era, we already start to see that there are some texts that have a religious framework, but at the same time are starting to embody these more inquisitive ideas of the Renaissance. So if we go way back to the 13th century and look at the works of Dante, in the Divine Comedy. He is definitely very religious in the way that he writes because he features hell, purgatory, and heaven. But despite this, you can still see the inquiring spirit of the Renaissance because Dante is definitely clear about his reverence for pagan writers. He very obviously criticizes the corruption in the church. And even more importantly, Dante writes the Divine Comedy in Italian instead of Latin. So that's a big change from the medieval era. Renaissance popes acted as patrons of famous artists for the Renaissance quite frequently. So many of the most important sculptures and paintings from the Southern Renaissance have religious subjects. And as the Renaissance in the South continued until the 16th century, you still see a close connection with the church, even though secular thought grew. So I just wanted to draw your attention to why these pieces of art could be both secular and religious at the same time. The one in the middle, in particular, has to a certain extent still a religious bent because it is a marriage, which is clearly a sacrament. But at the same time, this focus on symmetry, this focal point, and also just emphasizing a very Greco-Roman structure in the background is something that is also secular, something that has Renaissance ideas. These two are much more secular in nature. Of course, the Mona Lisa is focused on a non-religious figure and arguably is much more focused on individualism, humanism, because it's focusing on the details of her face. Religious art was much less detailed in terms of facial structure. And also, you can see the same attention to humanism and individualism in the detail in which Da Vinci sketches the human body. The Renaissance in the North was a little bit different. By about 1400, the Renaissance spirit had spread to Northern Europe. So when I say Northern Europe, I really mean the Netherlands, the Baltic Sea coast, England, France. So there's a much greater emphasis on piety among even the lay people. And when I say the lay people or the laity, I just mean people who are not members of the clergy. And at the same time, there was an increasing interest in understanding the physical world. So Geoffrey Chaucer, who was from England, when he wrote the Canterbury Tales in the late 14th century, he was really portraying a microcosm of middle-class occupations in England, including several church positions. So his social satire of monks who loved hunting and overly sentimental nuns provided an example of humanism in that Chaucer was focusing on worldly secular life, but he was still acknowledging the importance of the church and the occupations connected with it. So just like Dante in his Divine Comedy, which we just talked about, Chaucer wrote in the vernacular. He wrote in Middle English. But many of Chaucer's other writings were in Latin. But still, the Canterbury Tales is a good example to use, showing that change, even really early on before the Renaissance really catches on in Northern Europe. In terms of politics, you start to see the development of newly centralized monarchies in England and France during the Renaissance time, which is a key difference. So you can think of people like Henry VIII in England, or you could also, of course, think about Elizabeth afterward, Queen Elizabeth. And then you could think about someone like Henry of Navarre or all of the Louis, of course, in France as a good example of more centralization of monarchies. And of course, eventually that leads to absolutism in these places. In terms of art, it differed from the more religious and classical art of Italy. It still had religious themes, of course. If you think about Van Eyck's famous painting here, there's clearly a religious idea because this is a married couple. They are definitely engaging in that sacrament. At the same time, it's still focusing on its lay people, right? It is not members of the clergy. And there's quite a bit of attention to their facial features and just the general detail of the painting, which is less religious in nature. It very more frequently reflected middle-class occupations and peasant celebrations, just in terms of Renaissance art in the North. In terms of writing, one of the most famous Renaissance Northern writers that I would mention would be Erasmus, who was Dutch, and his most famous book was In Praise of Folly, Dutch humanist of the late 15th century. And Erasmus is still deeply religious, although he is a humanist thinker, and a good friend of Henry VIII, I might add. Nicholas Copernicus shows you a good example of the connection between Renaissance thinking and, of course, the scientific revolution. Copernicus was from Poland, and his work in particular on the revolution of the heavenly spheres, which ultimately leads to heliocentricity, or the idea that the sun is the center of the earth, not the earth, as Aristotle had once said. His work shows increasing interest in understanding the physical world, which was an interest that sometimes led to conflict with the Catholic Church. And we will continue to talk about that new scientific thinking and, of course, other continued elements of knowledge when we talk about industrialization in period 4. But that's it for this segment, finally, in medieval Europe. Lots of videos for this segment, but hope they help you with preparing for the AP exam. Thanks, as always. We'll continue with the Mongols soon, so stay tuned for that, and thanks.